Half a day. Today I'm going to discuss the Chapter 3 questions from the syllabus, the colonial ways of life. The first question deals with how can we explain the major factors that contributed to the demographic changes that took place in the English colonies during the 18th century. What you have to remember about North America is that it is a vast land that is largely underpopulated. Only the Native Americans were there, and relatively speaking, there aren't, compared to the immigration populations that are inundating the colonies, there's not a lot of them as compared to the Europeans that are now beginning to come in. There's scarce labor, which means that those that immigrate to North America probably have a good opportunity to make a decent amount of money. Laws of economics. Something that's scarce is valuable. If you have a low supply of something, you're going to be able to demand a higher price for it. And the living conditions in North America are a little healthier than they are in crowded Europe. And this resulted in a rapid population growth. Unbelievably, the American population doubles every 25 years in the colonial era. The birth rate rose and the death or the mortality rate declines. The mortality rate is much lower than in Europe, and that's the main reason why the population explodes. The second question is describe women's various roles in the English colonies. Generally speaking, this is a man's world. Women's rights is a relatively new phenomena in the political world. It's only existed for the last 98 years in terms of the American political tradition. In the colonies, they have inferior status to males, but they have opportunities and they do have property rights under the law. They are mainly domestic. Their realm is in the home and in the fields or gardens around the home. And they can assume control of a business if their husband dies. And a classic example of that is the tavern business. Many American women will operate taverns. As we'll see, that will become significant during the time of Andrew Jackson. The third question, compare the societies and economies of the Southern, Middle, and New England colonies. Generally speaking, this is a rapidly expanding colony in all three sectors. In the South, it's dominated by the slavocracy or the plantation economy, which is slave-based, which means that there is inequality. In New England, there are townships of equally divided parcels. They're mainly English people that are living in the Northeast. There is a pact between church and state. And at this time, in the early America, every town had to collect taxes to support a church. All were required to attend sermons in midweek and on Sunday. Again, that will lead to problems. As we saw, Roger Williams will leave and establish a new colony in Rhode Island for those who object to some of these practices. In the 1690s, there were the Salem witch trials, which reflected the massive social changes that are going on in Massachusetts during that decade at the end of the 17th century. They are mainly involved in fishing and farming for a time. Farming is very difficult to do. Eventually, New England will get into the shipping business because there are vast forests in the Ohio Valley, and when those timbers are exploited and shipped east, eventually they will conduct a very vibrant shipping or shipbuilding industry. And out of that shipbuilding industry will become the whaling industry of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Whales won't be saved, ladies and gentlemen. They're going to be hunted to near extermination. And what are they going to do with these captured or hunted whales? They will use the blubber from the species, and they will get the oil from them, and this oil will be made into kerosene, which is the main source of light in the early 19th century before the adoption of electricity in the second half of the 19th century. The middle colonies are more diverse. There is some plantation operation, but it's mostly in the southern part of Virginia. The Dutch patroons operated in New York. They had vast estates on Long Island, the Hudson, and the Mohawk River valleys. There is a lot more ethnic diversity because of the various religions that exist there. There were many Jews who came to the New York region. As mentioned earlier in a previous chapter, there are the Catholics living in Maryland. And because of this diversity, it has a tradition, the middle colonies, of social tolerance. The fourth question: describe the creation of race-based slavery during the 17th century and its impact on the social and economic development of colonial America. Eventually, slavery will become a lifelong status. It wasn't that way in Europe or the Middle East. Slaves could actually own slaves. Slaves could buy their freedom. But because the colonists, under the influence of the plantation owners, worried about a source of labor, which is scarce, they come to adopt laws that make this a race-based slavery. And they used a lot of mythology and racism to justify these laws. The ideas that blacks were inferior, that they had less capacity for learning, that they were less intelligent than whites. All sorts of nonsense that was commonly believed in the 18th and 19th centuries. Slavery was legal in all the colonies, but again, it's mostly predominant in the South because of the plantation system. But all over the colonies, there will be a deep-rooted color prejudice where whites will come to believe themselves as being superior to the colored populations, not only Africans, but also the Native American groups as well. Slavery was very profitable, ladies and gentlemen. One of the reasons why it's going to exist as long as it did. People made a great deal of money off of this. And by 1865, the entire 1860 actually, excuse me, the entire economy is pretty much revolving around this system, which will lead to the abolitionists advocating its elimination because of its corruption of society. Slave codes were enacted to regulate behavior of slaves, and this will result in many rebellions, such as the Stonewall Rebellion in 1739 in Charleston. Eventually the rebels were subdued and 60 of them were beheaded. And their heads were placed on pikes, placed every mile as a warning to not engage in this behavior in the future. The fifth question in this particular chapter, and this is big, ladies and gentlemen, to analyze the impact of the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening on American thought. You cannot underestimate this impact. Britain is a very prosperous country. It has become the leading empire in the world by the end of the 1700s. There is a great interest in British luxury goods. It is a trait of a prosperous economy that they're going to make more high-end products for those that have the money to buy them, and many people did, such as the plantation owners in the Americas. There will become a lack of money or specie in the Americas, and this will be a perennial problem until the adoption of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. There's always a lack of currency available in the Americas. There will be an urban elite that develop in the cities, and as a result of the growth of cities, there's many problems there, mainly fire, and this is why volunteer fire companies will develop, because fire is a constant threat in the Americas all through the 20th century until the post-World War II period with the adoption of more modern electrical systems. Sanitation, what to do with the garbage? And the immediate solution was we're going to bury it. And that will lead to problems in the 1970s and 80s with all of these landfills that, especially where I come from in Tonawanda, New York, the landfill there has been closed for a couple decades now, and now they're getting natural gas that is developing out of these fills. What to do with the poor and the perennial problems of crime. Travel in the taverns. Taverns will be a useful place to pick up knowledge. It's dangerous to travel at night, so the taverns operators would also engage in motel business, giving people rooms to stay in for the night. Eventually the postal system will develop, but it's still very slow at this time with the lack of proper roads. One of the American traditions is the idea of the freedom of the press. John Peter Zenger criticized the royal governor of New York, and he will be acquitted by a jury of his peers who in their findings will say that there is no crime for telling the truth. And that's an important idea of the freedom of the press. The Enlightenment is the idea of using reason. It begins in Europe with the French philosophers. It will continue in the Americas. The scientific method is believed to be the right way to try to deal with problems. We must find the nature of things. We must go to the root of things in order to discern what things are about. This has its roots with Copernicus back in the 1400s. Out of these Enlightenment philosophers, and many of them will become deists who believe that God created the universe, that God was a master mechanic who enacted laws of how the universe operates. And what is the duty of human beings? To find out what these natural laws are. This is a rational God, and we must pray for guidance. The idea of natural rights comes out of this idea. There will be a great awakening at different times in American history. Religious revivals will come out of these awakenings, and there'll be traveling evangelists that will go through the colonies in the 1720s and 40s. Jonathan Edwards was a brilliant Yale preacher who wrote the famous tract Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. George Whitefield was another traveling English evangelist who delivered intense sermons. He was the most celebrated promoter of the Great Awakening. What do these evangelists do? They basically challenge the establishment, the established churches, right? They're getting a little bit old. They're getting a little bit boring. And now you've got these new faces, these new preachers coming in. They're lively. They speak with great passion and emotion. And that helped to spur people to seek more religious answers again for the problems of the day. And out of these traveling evangelists, an individualism emerges in American society, which is a established resistance to authority. It's a big part of the American creed, the idea of individualism. That is all for this chapter.